In 1974, while American kids escaped into Saturday morning cartoons, their parents were rationing groceries as inflation soared to 11%, and the price of turkey doubled in just 3 years. Those classic holiday photos do not reveal the food lines with 1,000 people, the empty tables, or the crushing fear that Thanksgiving might never feel the same again. What really happened to the families behind the nostalgia? By the autumn of 1974, paychecks were shrinking in real terms, even as the hours got longer. The Bureau of Labor Statistics measured inflation at 11% that year, the highest Americans had seen since the Depression. For families living on a median household income of around $9,000, every trip to the grocery store felt heavier. The cost of everyday goods climbed relentlessly. Gasoline, once a minor expense, became a daily worry. The OPEC oil embargo had pushed the price at the pump from 36 cents a gallon in 1972 to over $1 by the decade's end. Long lines snaked from gas stations, sometimes for hours, as parents rationed fuel and weighed every errand. Unemployment followed close behind. The jobless rate hit 8.5% in 1975, with some cities, Detroit, Youngstown, and Pittsburgh, seeing rates far higher. Factories closed, and the promise that hard work would secure a better life faded. For the first time in a generation, headlines questioned whether children would do as well as their parents. The Consumer Price Index spiked month after month, and the price tags on the grocery shelves seemed to change overnight. Wages lagged behind, eroding purchasing power by as much as 30% over the decade. This pressure seeped into every household budget. The weekly ritual of planning Thanksgiving dinner became an exercise in subtraction, not abundance. Parents clipped coupons and made lists, crossing out ingredients that had become too expensive. In neighborhoods across the country, anxiety replaced anticipation. The numbers, 11% inflation and 8.5% unemployment, were more than statistics. They were the reason so many families approached the holiday with a sense of dread, unsure how far their money would stretch, and what, if anything, would be left to put on the table. Receipts from 1972 and 1975 tell the story with a kind of blunt honesty that no headline could match. In 1972, a pound of frozen turkey cost just 39 cents at the local supermarket. By 1975, that same pound rang up at 79 cents. For a family shopping for a 15-pound bird, the price had leapt from under $6 to nearly $12. The USDA's annual chart, once a quiet reference in the back of the Sunday paper, now showed a line that climbed so sharply it seemed almost like a mistake. But it was not. This was the reality stamped on every grocery slip, every week, in every town. The jump was not just a number, it was a shock that hit the dinner table. A full Thanksgiving meal for 10, which had cost $34 just 3 years earlier, now ran $68, outpacing the rise in every other food staple. Ads from 1973 boasted turkeys for 49 cents a pound. But by 1975, stores limited families to a single bird each, and the price tag hovered near 90 cents. The explanation was always the same: feed costs, fuel costs, shortages. But no explanation softened the blow for parents doing the math in the aisles, crossing off side dishes, and wondering if there would be enough left for pie. The numbers were clear, but their meaning was personal. Each doubled price on a receipt meant something else would have to go. The tradition of a holiday feast, once taken for granted, became a calculation. The pain of that calculation showed up in the smallest places: smaller birds, fewer trimmings, and a quiet sense of loss that settled over the checkout line. For millions, Thanksgiving was no longer about abundance. It was about making do and hoping the family would not notice what was missing. On Thanksgiving week in 1974, a line stretched for blocks outside a Brooklyn church. More than 1,000 people waited in the cold, hoping for a donated turkey or even a bag of canned goods. The air was thick with silence and exhaustion. Parents stood with children, bundled in hand-me-down coats, while volunteers hustled back and forth, their faces drawn from too many hours and too few supplies. News crews captured the scene, a crowd so large it spilled into the street with police directing traffic around the queue. Inside, folding tables buckled under the weight of expectation. Charity workers sorted boxes of potatoes, bread, and whatever turkeys remained. By noon, the supply ran low and the line barely moved. Some families had been waiting since dawn. A mother clutched a numbered ticket, her youngest asleep against her shoulder. For many, this was the only chance at a holiday meal. Across the city, the story repeated itself. Food banks and pantries reported a surge in requests, far beyond anything they'd seen before. In Chicago, 500 families gathered outside a Salvation Army outpost, hoping for a 10-pound bird or a sack of rice. National networks of food aid, the forerunners of Feeding America, logged a 20% jump in holiday demand between 1973 and 1976. The volunteers did what they could, but the need outpaced the resources. By late afternoon, word spread down the line. No more turkeys. Some left with only a loaf of bread, others with nothing at all. The disappointment hung heavy. These were not the poorest neighborhoods, but working families, retirees, and veterans, all brought low by a crisis that had turned a national holiday into a test of endurance. The evidence played out in every city. Scarcity was no longer hidden. It was visible, undeniable, and standing in line for everyone to see. Thanksgiving in the mid-1970s brought a quiet strain to families across 3 generations. Grandparents, many living on fixed Social Security checks, watched their purchasing power shrink by 15% as prices outpaced their benefits. For some, this meant skipping meals or quietly passing on seconds so their grandchildren could eat. The AARP published letters from seniors describing a holiday table with fewer dishes and a silent worry about the next month's bills. Parents faced a different kind of pressure. Manufacturing layoffs swept the country, cutting 2.5 million jobs in just a few years. Fathers and mothers who once counted on steady work now scanned the classifieds, their pride bruised by pink slips. Some picked up shifts at diners or gas stations, stringing together part-time work that barely covered the basics. The Thanksgiving table reflected these new realities: smaller turkeys, canned vegetables instead of fresh, and pies that came from a box, not an oven. A family photo from Detroit in 1973 shows a table set for 5, but the centerpiece is a chicken, not a turkey. A quiet sign of how far traditions had slipped. Children felt the difference in subtle ways. They noticed the smaller portions, the missing side dishes, the way parents lingered in the kitchen whispering about money. Oral histories from the era recall kids asking why there was no pumpkin pie, or why Grandpa just smiled and said he was not hungry. For many, it was the first time Thanksgiving felt less like a celebration and more like a reminder of what had been lost. The hardship did not just show up in numbers or headlines. It played out in living rooms and kitchens, in the hush that settled over dinner, and in the careful way leftovers were wrapped for the days ahead. In the years after Vietnam, thousands of young men returned to a country in crisis. The welcome home was quiet, sometimes cold, and for many there was no family waiting at the door. By Thanksgiving 1974, the economy had left even the most resilient feeling adrift. Shelters in cities like New York and Chicago reported a wave of new faces, veterans who had survived the jungle only to find themselves alone in America. Veterans Administration intake records from that year show a marked increase in admissions around the holidays, with some missions logging a 30% jump in the week of Thanksgiving alone. One veteran who had arrived back stateside just months before found himself at a church shelter on the Bowery. He wrote in his journal that morning about the sound of cartoons drifting from a black and white television in the corner, a reminder of childhood Saturdays that felt impossibly far away. There was turkey on the menu, but it was thin, stretched with broth and served with instant potatoes. He didn't mention the taste. He wrote about the silence at the table and the way the room filled with men who barely spoke. Across the country, the same story played out. Nearly 1 million Vietnam veterans had come home since 1970, but unemployment for them hovered near 15%, more than double the national average. Many were too proud or too ashamed to call their families. For these men, Thanksgiving was just another day marked by absence, a holiday observed in the lines outside a shelter, in the shuffle of boots on tile floors, in the knowledge that the country had moved on without them. Supermarkets in 1974 tried to put a brave face on scarcity. Circulars advertised economy Thanksgiving kits, chicken instead of turkey, instant mashed potatoes, canned peas stacked high where fresh produce once stood. A full chicken dinner kit cost $4.99 at A&P, less than half the price of a modest turkey. Managers encouraged shoppers to stretch meals, offering recipe cards for casseroles that relied on breadcrumbs and canned soup. The substitution was not just about saving money. It was about salvaging the idea of a holiday feast when the main dish was out of reach. Charities and churches stepped in, serving record numbers. A Salvation Army ledger from November 1974 recorded over 10,000 Thanksgiving meals distributed in 1 week, a figure nearly double the previous year. Volunteers worked overtime, organizing communal dinners in church basements and school gyms. The food was simple, but the rooms were full. For many, this was the only way to share a meal with others, even as pride made some families reluctant to join the line. Retail workers faced a different kind of loss. Department stores and supermarkets, under pressure to keep doors open, scheduled mandatory shifts on Thanksgiving Day. Union grievances filed in Detroit and Pittsburgh told the story. Single parents working 12-hour days, missing dinner entirely, leaving children with neighbors or older siblings. Pay stubs showed time and a half, but no amount could buy back the hours lost. The quiet cost of survival was measured in empty chairs and unopened cans of cranberry sauce. In the stories children carried long after the table was cleared. The memory comes back in pieces. The clatter of pans, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint sound of cartoons drifting from the living room. For one now grown child, Thanksgiving in 1974 is forever tied to the smell of instant potatoes and the ache of something missing. She remembers standing on tiptoe at the kitchen door, watching her mother press a hand to her eyes, shoulders shaking in silence. The turkey was smaller that year, barely enough for everyone, and the pies were gone, replaced by a single can of fruit cocktail. In the next room, her younger brother laughed at a rerun of Fat Albert, not noticing the way their father lingered at the window, staring out at the gray afternoon. Years later, in a StoryCorps interview, she recalled, "I thought the grown-ups were fighting. I didn't know it was money. My mom said she had something in her eye, but I saw her wiping her face with a dish towel." For many, the sound of laughter from the TV mixed with the quiet tears of parents doing their best. The holiday didn't end with a fight or a feast, just the careful scraping of plates and a promise that next year would be better. For children, those small details became the shape of Thanksgiving, a memory of love, loss, and the things left unsaid. Optimism, once woven into the fabric of American life, began to unravel by the middle of the decade. In 1965, Gallup found that nearly 2/3 of Americans believed their children would have a better life than they did. By 1974, that number had collapsed to barely a quarter. The sense that each generation would climb higher was replaced by a quiet dread, one that showed up in dinner table conversations and in the lines outside government offices. The government's answer to hunger was the food stamp program, but help moved slowly. Applications stacked up in county offices, and the wait for approval stretched from weeks to months. A Government Accountability Office memo from early 1975 described more than 500,000 pending cases nationwide, with some families waiting through the holidays without any support. In some cities, the backlog topped 1,000 cases at a single office. The process was tangled in paperwork and underfunded staff, leaving families to fend for themselves while official promises went unkept. The gap between need and response grew wider with every passing month. Gallup's poll numbers and government memos told a story of institutions buckling under pressure, unable to keep pace with the crisis. For families who had once believed in the steady progress of American life, the holiday table became a stark reminder of how far that faith had fallen. The scars of those lean years did not fade with the return of prosperity. For many who grew up in the shadow of the scarcity of the 1970s, the lessons of empty cupboards and anxious holidays shaped enduring habits that lingered for decades. A longitudinal study by the American Psychological Association tracked children from that era into adulthood and found 1 in 4 developed patterns of hoarding food or avoiding holidays altogether. The instinct to stockpile canned goods, to fill freezers with more than anyone could eat, became a quiet ritual in countless homes. Some adults still feel anxiety when shelves look bare, or when a holiday approaches and the table seems too small. The study found that memories of parents skipping meals or whispering about bills left a mark, subtle but stubborn. For these now-grown children, the sound of a can opener or the sight of a half-empty pantry can trigger a wave of unease, even when money is no longer tight. The anxiety of not having enough, learned at the kitchen table in the 1970s, echoes in the way they shop, cook, and gather for Thanksgiving today. The crisis did not end with the numbers. It settled deep into daily life, a legacy passed from one generation to the next. Today, over 44 million Americans still struggle with food insecurity, even as grocery costs reach record highs. The gap between nostalgia and reality is not just history, it shapes how families gather, cope, and endure right now. When tradition collides with hardship, memory becomes both comfort and warning. The heart of Thanksgiving remains fragile, depending on what and whom we choose not to forget. Share your perspective below.